Hi, I'm William Spaniel. Let's learn about international relations. Today's topic is veto power in the Security Council. And the big question we're going to address in this lecture is how does the veto power in the Security Council affect resolution passage rates? And I want to start off with a not so trivial trivia question. This is the question. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 82 authorized a UN intervention in the Korean War. Why didn't the Soviet Union exercise its veto power on that resolution? So in case you didn't know, during the Korean War, it was North Korea against a United Nations coalition, which included South Korea and the United States, but was also backed by the Security Council itself. Why didn't the Soviet Union exercise its veto power here? Was it A, because the USSR believed that Kim Il-sung was corrupt? B, because the USSR didn't understand that its veto power prevented the United Nations Security Council from becoming the United States' puppet? C, because the ambassador of the Soviet Union was an American spy? Or D, because the Soviet ambassador was hungover, got up late, and missed the vote due to New York City traffic? So think about that one. You can pause the video here if you need to, answer it in the comment section, and in the meantime, I'm going to show you a graph that gives us an illustration of Security Council vetoes over time. So here we see the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: China, France, United Kingdom, United States, and the Soviet Union / Russia. We see 3 different colored hues: blue, a light blue, and red. The blue represents the number of vetoes each of these countries made during the early part of the Cold War from 1946 to 1965. That lightish blue is the number of vetoes that each of these states made during the latter half of the Cold War from 1966 to 1985. And the red part is the tail end of the Cold War, as well as the present era, the post-Cold War era. There are just a couple of things that are worth noting here. The first is that during the beginning of the Cold War, it's basically the Soviet Union who's doing all of the vetoing, right? Because we have a whole bunch of Western allies on the Security Council. We have the lone Soviet communist Eastern guy on the Security Council. Hold your objection on China for a moment, and you'll understand why I didn't say anything about China there. And so what's going on is we have a lot of pro-Western legislation that's being pushed into the Security Council, and the Soviet Union is having to veto it. But then the Cold War ends, and the United States suddenly becomes the lone superpower left on the block, and it's now the United States that's actually blocking a lot of legislation, a lot of these resolutions, and like I mentioned in the last video, particularly on resolutions involving Israel. And you can see that the United States in this 1986 to 2007 period is doing virtually all of the vetoing. There's very few from Russia, United Kingdom, France, or China. Now, the fact that vetoes can happen actually has an effect on resolutions themselves. It's not just that you can veto legislation or resolutions that come by you, but the fact that I know that you can do this affects whether I actually even put that legislation forward. And so you can see by the numbers here, during the Cold War from 1945 to 1990, only 687 resolutions get through the Security Council. And in the post-Cold War era, from 1990 to today, we have 1,400 resolutions. So that's twice the number of resolutions in half the time. So what's going on there during the Cold War is that we know that the Soviet Union is going to veto anything that they don't like, and the Soviet Union knows that the United States is going to veto anything that the United States doesn't like, and so a lot of that legislation never even makes it to the floor of the Security Council because everyone knows it's going to be a waste of time. So the only reason that you would want to put something on the floor of the Security Council that you know is going to get vetoed by the other guy is if you want to embarrass him by having to force him to veto that legislation. After the Cold War ends, though, we see a lot more consensus in the international community, and this really begins with the Persian Gulf War. The Persian Gulf War, of course, the United States had a bulk of the military might there, but that was an international effort with a lot of countries backed by Security Council approval. And that gives us a nice transition back into that trivia question. So why was it the case that the Soviet Union did not exercise its veto power when the United Nations sent a security force to Korea? The answer is B. The Soviet Union didn't really understand that its veto power prevented the Security Council from becoming the United States' puppet. And to understand what the Soviet Union was thinking, how this might seem plausible and logical at first, we got to talk about China. So China was a winner of World War II, and that's why it has a spot on the Security Council as a permanent member with veto status. But at the end of World War II, China was a gigantic mess, and not just because of the Japanese invasion. The Chinese Civil War started in 1927, and during the start of World War II and all throughout World War II, the Civil War didn't really come to an end. They essentially called a timeout on it until the Second World War ended. But once that Second World War ended, the Chinese Civil War starts back up in earnest, and they keep fighting, and they don't stop fighting until 1950. Now, at the end of the World War, what happens is China's permanent seat goes to the Republic of China. So 1945, it's the Republic of China that's sitting on the Security Council. But the Republic of China is the loser of the Chinese Civil War. And that government essentially becomes the government of what we think of as Taiwan today in 1950. Now, the Soviet Union is kind of upset about this because even in 1950, the controller of that veto power, the spot on the Security Council, it belongs to Taiwan. It does not belong to mainland China. And so the Soviet Union is like, well, this is silly. The People's Republic of China won the Chinese Civil War. They are the successor state of China. And so they should have the seat on the Security Council. But of course, the United States doesn't care. The United States has veto power. If you have veto power, then you're good to go. If you like the status quo, if you like the way things are in the world and you have veto power on the Security Council, you're in a wonderful position because anytime you see something you don't like, you can just say no. And the Soviet Union knows this. And the way they try to go about fixing this and resolving this is to boycott the Security Council and boycott the United Nations. They're like, this isn't right. The mainland China, the winners of the Chinese Civil War, should have that spot on the Security Council. We're going to boycott the Security Council. And the United States kind of just shakes his head. It's like, yeah, that's cool. Whatever. Go ahead and boycott. We're going to do our own little thing. And as a result, without the Soviet Union there on the Security Council to block legislation, the United States can start proposing hugely pro-American resolutions. And the Security Council, of course, is very much pro-United States now because there isn't the Soviet Union anymore. And so the Security Council is essentially doing what the United States wants it to do. So this plan really backfires for the Soviet Union. And in fact, the Soviet Union realizes its mistake soon thereafter and ends the boycott after 8 months. And so this is eventually how the Security Council membership evolves. So we start off with the United States, the Soviet Union, Taiwan, the Republic of China, right there in the middle. That's the middle flag. You have France and the United Kingdom, and then it evolves from the Republic of China to mainland China when Nixon goes to China in 1971, and then finally the way we get to where we are today is the Soviet Union splits, Russia becomes the official successor state, and there you go, we have our current membership today. So that wraps up our look on veto power as it has been, and now we're going to be looking at what goes on behind the scenes with veto power. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about why states do not veto resolutions they don't like. You have the power to veto resolutions that you don't like, and yet you still might not do that anyway, and we'll see why that's the case in the next lecture. Hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you next time. Take care.